Hello, Rupert.
Hello, Alex.
So we've had more than 100 hours of conversation on Zoom, but this is the first time we're actually meeting in person to record one. And out of the many ideas that interest us, we're going to discuss one in particular, which is the question of where are memories stored, and actually turning that question into a question and asking whether memories are stored in the brain. It's a difficult one, but a fascinating one to think about. So how would you address that so that's conceivable? Because I mentioned it to a leading researcher in the field of memory, and he told me, well, Alex, that sounds interesting, but to me it's absolutely unthinkable that memories would not be stored inside our heads.
I think this leads back to the common influence on both of us, namely the French philosopher Henri Bergson. And Bergson, in the late 19th century, in 1896, in his book Matter and Memory, argued that the brain is not a reservoir of images, it's not a filing cabinet where memories are stored. Rather, memories work through the brain. And I think you make the point that William James, the American psychologist, also thought in terms of the brain in a different way, not that it was producing thought. As T.H. Huxley said, the brain produces thought as the liver secretes bile. You know, thought's just a kind of secretion of the brain. But William James put it rather clearly, didn't he?
Yes, these are old ideas, but still totally pioneering. Today, James said something apparently obvious, which is that the brain has a function in thought, but then the key question is what's the nature of that function, whether it's productive or permissive. So here we have two classes, two ways of thinking about the mind and its relationship with the brain. And the orthodox way of thinking about it is, of course, the brain produces everything, perception, memory, and consciousness, and so on. But the Bergsonian or Jamesian way of thinking about it, and the way we also like to think about it, is that the brain receives and filters the mind, and in that case, memories would not need to be stored physically inside the brain. But then the question is, where are they stored? And whether that makes any sense to say, well, they're not in the brain. Where are they? In the body and the brain? Are they in the body, the brain, and the world? Or everywhere, or maybe nowhere? I would say Bergson's answer would be they are in time, not in space.
Yes, but I think the metaphor that I find easiest to think about this through is television, because the idea that the brain's productive of thought and consciousness is rather like a video recorder. Everything's there inside the video recorder. It doesn't need any outside influence. It produces all those sounds and pictures from within itself, from stored memories in files on tapes or flash drives or whatever. Whereas a television depends on influences coming from outside the circuitry of the television. That's not inside the TV set. The TV set's necessary for receiving it and manifesting the pictures and the sounds, but they're coming from somewhere else. And in the case of TV, from a TV transmitter. Whereas when Bergson says they're in time, what he's saying really is that they're coming across time or through time, the memories, that they're transmitted through or across time. TV is transmitted through or across space. And this is, of course, an unfamiliar idea, but I think that the TV analogy, which didn't exist, of course, in Bergson's day, or William James's, it was before radio and television became widespread, but we now have technologies that make it very clear to us that it's not all just inside. I mean, a mobile telephone, for example, wouldn't make sense if it was all just inside the mobile phone. All you do is hear recordings of yourself. The whole point of it is that it's receiving transmissions from outside itself, electromagnetic waves, and transforming them and transforming what you say into it into electromagnetic waves that go elsewhere. So I think that most of our modern technologies, like radios, telephones, and television, and the internet, insofar as a lot of it comes through satellites and so on, are actually coming from somewhere else. And so I think that's the shift in thinking that Bergson was pointing towards.
Yeah, and it's interesting you point to technological metaphors, because there's a dominant one, but there are many ways to think about this problem, also considering the hologram, which is a tricky one. And when it comes to, so we could ask, from the orthodox point of view, well, haven't we already shown, haven't neuroscientists already shown that memories are stored in the brain? But as you and I and many other people may know, this quest has been going on for more than a century. It is as old as these ideas we're talking about, the quest for the engram, right? It's like the physical location of memories. And there are many types of memories, and one could explain their differences, but the basic idea is, well, there must be a register somewhere in the brain, and they've been looking for them. And I joke because they've been finding them, but never quite there. It's there, but then it seems that this information is not there when you go back the next day. It may have moved somewhere else in the brain. So that slowly leads into a dynamical view, a resonant view of what may be going on in the brain, because again, we're not saying that the brain plays no role. Of course it plays a huge role, but maybe not how we are primed to think about it. And in a way this has to do a lot with your own views about resonant patterns and morphic resonance, which we can discuss now or a bit later if you wish. But I want to center the discussion around, well, haven't we found already memories in the brain? Well, the answer is always yes, but, or yes and no. It's funny, interesting.
Well, they haven't really found engrams at all. They've tried many times, but failed many times. The most spectacular failure was at the beginning when Carl Lashley, the great American neuroscientist, tried to find where the memories were stored in the brain by training rats and monkeys to learn new tricks, and then cutting out different bits of the brain. He found if he cut out all the brain, they couldn't do anything, but that simply proved they were paralyzed without a brain. But he could cut out large chunks of the brain, right, left, top, bottom, front, back. And the loss of these large brain regions didn't affect their memory. So he couldn't find memory anywhere localized in the brain. And similar experiments by a researcher called Boycott with octopuses showed the same thing. He could cut out various bits of their brain and they still remembered. And as he put it, memory seems to be both everywhere and nowhere in particular. And Lashley's student, Carl Pribram, then took Lashley's results and reformulated them in terms of his holographic theory of memory storage, that memory is stored like in a hologram all over the brain, not being localized. So the idea of being able to find a localized trace was given up as a result of that research. And so that meant that it became almost irrefutable, because if you damaged any bit of the brain and the memory still persists, you say, well, it must be somewhere else. And ever since then, people have been trying to find memories. Stephen Rose did it with day-old chicks. He taught them to respond to a moving object by imprinting, and then found that a particular bit of the brain was involved when that learning happened, labelled with radioactive glucose, that those cells were more active. They thought they'd found the memory trace. Then it turned out that if you cut that region out of the brain, they can still remember. So they just say, oh, well, they've been moved somewhere else. So over and over again since then, including very sophisticated modern research with optogenetics, where they label nerve cells with green fluorescent protein, as you know, and can actually see which cells are involved. It turns out that certain cells are involved when a memory is laid down in mice, for example, but then when they remember that memory, different cells might be involved. They only overlap to about 10% in some cases. Moreover, if you cut out those cells after a day or two, the memory is still there, and so they say it's been consolidated, it's been moved somewhere else in the brain. Yes. So whenever they think they've found it, they always end up saying it's moved somewhere else.
Yes, technically we're far beyond James and Bergson with the abilities we have in the lab to, as you say, to visualize activity in the brain as animals are learning tricks, for instance. Also to manipulate that activity, to even try to tag certain neurons and then come back to them and so on. But conceptually, we are far, far before Bergson and James, and yet, I would say, to put it in a way, in a positive manner, the trend seems to be moving in that direction, because now the emphasis is on networks that have dynamical properties, with technical names like manifolds, and the dynamical systems approach to neuroscience is also taking off and adopted, more widely adopted. And this leads to these brain waves going back and forth. And so this, in a way, can bridge the gap between localization of function, this natural quest to see where is that function, which is an old quest, starting with phrenology, this idea that by exploring the bumps in your head, you could tell how a person was. Well, we know that's not like that, but nevertheless, this localization of function seems to be getting distributed, dynamical, and so it seems to me that it's tending towards that really powerful idea that's still quite daunting to the sciences, and not just neuroscience. We could also speak about developmental biology and so on. So it seems we're getting there, but not as fast as we would like to.
Yes, well, what it seems to be showing, this recent research, is that it's all about wave patterns spread over the brain. And, this recent work showing that normally the wave patterns would go down from the outer parts of the brain to the hippocampus, which is concerned with localization. And then during sleep, waves would go in the opposite direction from the hippocampus to the other parts of the brain in what are called sharp wave ripples. So there's this, the idea that to remember something, animals often have to sleep after they've learned it, and what's associated with that are sharp wave ripples, and which may or may not be associated with dreaming, that the memories depend on these waves, and they're distributed wave patterns. And one of the most interesting things, I think, in recent brain research is the phenomenon of representational drift, where they find when animals remember something, there's a particular pattern, a rather complex wave pattern in the brain. And when they remember it again, you see the same wave pattern, but it's not necessarily in the same place. So it can move from one part of the brain to the other. What's important is the wave pattern, not the exact cells. And so the idea that memory is stored by modifying nerve endings or changing proteins in cells that are involved in engrams, supposedly, the idea that there would be physical material memory traces localized in particular regions, is not at all supported by this. What is supported is the idea that there are wave patterns, and the wave patterns are the key thing, and those can move around. And so the brain it doesn't have to be in a particular place. So then the question comes, if memory depends on wave patterns, how are wave patterns remembered? Because to make an engram, you've got to freeze a wave pattern. You've got to freeze it and make it static to have stuff like on a flash drive or on a grooves of an acoustic record, 78 RPM or a long player. You've got or the magnetic patterns on a tape in a tape recorder. You've got to freeze the sound or the wave pattern, make it static, and then you've got to reanimate it. But how you would freeze a wave pattern and then reanimate it in another part of the brain is totally unexplained by this research.
Yes.
And it points to something else going on that's not just freezing memory traces in synapses or in proteins or in cell membranes or even in DNA.
Yes. We're saying much more. Actually, you've been saying much more for many years. So what I want to emphasize now is not just the conceptual aspect, these ideas, but the fact that they can be tested. Because sometimes some people don't care so much about the concept and keep on doing their own research, and sometimes people who care about those ideas seem to behave as if they weren't irrelevant in experimentally, but you've been attempting to breach those and going beyond. So perhaps you could talk a bit about now morphic resonance and the idea that it's not just that memories may not be stored in the brain, but also that what we learn can be transferred in a non-local way to other brains of other fellow human beings or even across species. And furthermore, to the whole of nature. Actually, that's the thesis of your 1981 book, New Signs of Life. So it goes beyond brains in two senses.
Well, this is my own particular hypothesis, a very general hypothesis, that all of nature is essentially habitual, that the so-called laws of nature are like habits, that each species has a kind of collective memory. And how this works is through a kind of resonance between wave patterns. Everything in nature is made of wave patterns. Atoms are wave patterns. Molecules are wave patterns. The living organisms are full of wave patterns. We have brain wave patterns, we have heartbeats, we have breathing rates, we have wave patterns in ourselves, repetitive oscillations and very rapid wave activities at all levels of nature. And of course, this even works through galaxies. Even galaxies have great waves of electricity and cloud and like waves, actual vibratory waves going through them. So everything's vibratory in nature. And if wave patterns can influence subsequent similar wave patterns across space and time, which is what I think morphic resonance is, morphic being the word for form in Greek. So it's to do with the form or pattern of the waves. If they can act across time, then this would explain the memory. And with any given species, say an antelope, a baby antelope, being an antelope, would tune into the memories of previous antelopes and would have a collective memory of their instincts and would know how to behave automatically. A baby spider would know from tuning into the memory of web spinning behavior in previous spiders how to spin a web. I don't think all this is programmed in the DNA. DNA codes for proteins. So I think that within modern biology there's been a distortion of understanding by assuming that all heredity is crammed into the DNA, somehow programmed in a way that's never been explained, and all memories are crammed into the brain and somehow materially embodied there. I don't think either of those things are true, and I think that the resonant patterns that are now known to occur in brains and associated with learning and memory may well be part of this morphic resonance process. A similar pattern is set up as a resonance from the past, and the reason we remember our own memories is that we're most similar to ourselves in the past. Similarity is the key. Then you think, well, okay, well, what about people who are really, really similar but different, identical twins? Then there's lots of evidence they pick up from each other. Even separated at birth, they show many similarities. I don't think that's because it's all in the genes. I think it's because they're particularly resonant. And then collective memory, which the psychologist Jung talked about, is, I think, the way we tune up into lots of other people. We're similar to lots and lots of other people. More similar to some than others, and so we'd have more emphasis from our own family and our own immediate relatives and ancestors than from remote people in other parts of the world. So I think that the morphic resonance approach to memory explains the failure to find memory traces, and also makes the recent research showing things like representational drift and wave patterns as the key make much more sense. So it's not about engrams stored in the brain, it's about a resonance across time. And for somebody who thinks that there is no memory in nature, then, this is literally unthinkable. But why should someone think there's no memory in nature? Most people who think there's no memory in nature believe that nature is governed by the laws of nature. And what are the laws of nature? No one's ever seen a law of nature. No one's ever crystallized one. They're supposed to be everywhere, and yet nowhere in particular. The laws that govern the falling of an object. If I dropped something, it fell. The laws of gravitation are supposed to be working right here, but so the laws of electromagnetism and quantum theory and thermodynamics and stuff. They're everywhere. Well, if people say, well, how can memory be everywhere, potentially present everywhere, which is what I'm suggesting. If it works across time and you tune into it, it means the whole of the past is potentially present everywhere.
Yes.
How can it be everywhere? That's unthinkable. It's invisible and yet it's everywhere. Well, people who say that have taken for granted most of their lives that the laws of nature are everywhere and invisible, without, for a moment, questioning how could such a thing be possible. How could the law of nature, represented in a physics textbook as an equation, be present everywhere invisibly? So it's not as if morphic resonance is utterly mysterious compared with plain common sense.
Yes.
We have a choice between two mysteries, an amnesic universe governed by omnipresent laws of nature which no one's ever seen, or the idea of memory and habits in nature which fits the facts much better, especially in an evolutionary universe.
Yes, how beautiful we can go from asking this rather big question about where memories are in the brain to the whole of biology and even cosmology, and realize that we've inherited certain presuppositions as to the laws of the universe and how to even conceive it, and we don't question those. They make sense, but then when we ask similar questions in changing a little bit the subject, now it's not the laws of nature now but memories, then that seems unthinkable. So in a way what we're discussing goes beyond neuroscience and the sciences in general. It's about an understanding, a view of the world, and it's a quite beautiful and powerful and deep view of the world. I wanted to emphasize here, because you were talking about form, and as a physicist turned neuroscientist, we always speak about information, like physicists used to speak about energy, of course, and matter. Then the previous century was all about information. But if we forget about but the prefix, the question of form is still rather mysterious. And your work, as I understand it, concentrates on whence form, where does form come from, and how it maintains itself. And so these are juicy conceptual questions, the question of form and also the question of laws as habits, and they may seem too difficult to discuss, but in a way you also manage to explain them and test them in a way that makes sense. So they are mysterious, but at the same time they're in our everyday life. We see forms all over the place, and we may have even feelings that we can pick the thoughts of other people. I mean, it's our daily life is full of instances where this phenomena may manifest. Another one which we haven't mentioned is terminal lucidity. And these are corners of consciousness, but like when people are about to die and suddenly they remember all of those memories that they couldn't, and they may have had even like impaired cognition at the moment. So these are there's this landscape of anomalies that when you put them together, they're not so anomalous anymore. They're rather familiar to all of us, and at the same time mysterious. And that's what turns me on as a scientist, that one can study these phenomena that are both fascinating and also not so alien, I would say, at least to me.
No. Well, terminal lucidity, as you say, is when people have had Alzheimer's for years and people assume they've lost their memory because the memory traces have been wiped out by brain degeneration, can remember things that they're supposed to have forgotten. Well, how? If it's a tuning system rather than the memories themselves that have been lost, there may be some surge of energy, a last rally, or something may happen that enables them to tune into these memories they couldn't tune into before. It's rather like a damaged TV set. You may not get sounds and pictures, not because the transmissions have stopped, not because there's no longer BBC One or some particular TV channel, but because something's wrong with the set. And possibly, if you give the set a jolt, knock it or something, it might start working again. And so I think this mysterious reappearance of memories is a bit like that.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that the whole question of form is obviously involved in memory. A lot of memory is to do with recognition of patterns, like when you meet somebody you've met before. You recognise their face and you recognise them. That's you're recognizing the same form, and a lot of memories are about forms, patterns, structures. So I think memories are really, to do with this resonance of form, morphic resonance, and this is a testable hypothesis. If morphic resonance is true, then if a particular animal learns something new, then other similar animals should be able to learn it quicker because they share in the morphic resonance from the first animal. And if hundreds learn it, then it should be even easier, because there's much stronger morphic resonance from the past. I think this is going on all the time. A lot of people say that if they do the word puzzle Wordle later in the day, there's a new puzzle every day, they find it easier to solve than if they do it in the morning. And that could be because millions of people have done Wordle and it's made it easier for others to do it. And this is testable. I haven't been able to get hold of the Wordle data from the New York Times, who own Wordle, because they're terrible spoilsports and aren't prepared to look at this question. But there are other word puzzles where this could be tested. It can be tested with experiments with rats learning new tricks, and there's already a lot of evidence that when rats learn a new trick, other rats of the same kind find it easier. And one can also do experiments with model organisms used in biology labs, Sine rhabditis elegans, the nematode worm, and Drosophila melanogaster, the fruit fly. It's possible to develop quite simple experiments for this, and some of them I hope will be done in the near future. So this is eminently testable, this hypothesis, whereas the memory trace theory is turned into something that's become rather untestable, because with every failure they just say, oh, it must be somewhere else. And there's billions and billions of dollars being spent on this research program. Thousands and thousands of scientists have devoted their entire careers to this, fruitlessly. And I think because they're looking for something that isn't there.
Yes. This would lead us into sociological issues which I love to talk about, and even philosophical, but maybe in wrapping up, I would say that simply by re-asking the question, whatever your question is, a whole fruitful field of inquiry opens, and many times those fields are not explored for various reasons, and you've opened many of those fronts, and I hope people, including myself and others, would join to ask these new questions, which were in a way asked many decades ago, and recover those questions and have the courage and the good fortune to actually be able to look what's going on in there, and offering a kind of pluralism to science. There should be room for many different ways of approaching the very same phenomena, and in a way I think that's all we're asking for, like the possibility to even go to a neuroscience meeting and say, well, my question is whether memories are stored in the brain. Am I allowed to ask that question, or am I going to be immediately dismissed because that makes no sense? And so if we could do science like this, it would be more fun, more creative, and it could change the world, as the title of one of your books. These could be experiments that could change the world.
Well, yes. I mean, if these questions are opened up within institutional science, then I think it would get much more interesting. Right now, I mean, you're a neuroscientist and you go to neuroscience conferences. I don't. But I would guess that if you went to a neuroscience conference and said, are memories stored in the brain, people would look at you blankly. As you said, when one of your colleagues said that's completely unthinkable. Because if you start from the usual assumption, the mind is nothing but the activity of the brain, where else could memories be but inside the brain? They've got to be in the brain as material structures. It's unthinkable they could be anything else. But that's because they're presupposing a worldview that says there's no memory in nature, there's eternal laws which are everywhere, working all the time, and brains are produced, minds are produced by brains, and nothing but brains and brain activity. If you start with those assumptions, then you make any other alternative unthinkable.
Yes.
So I think I hope for those who are not familiar with these ideas already, that our discussion may help to make them more thinkable. And when they're more thinkable, they're more testable.
Yes.
And when they're tested, and if the results of the test suggest actually there is a resonance across time, this would move to a shift. It would lead us to a shift in thinking that I think would solve many outstanding problems in biology, not only memory, but also many aspects of inheritance that are not explained by genes.
Yes.
I think there's huge fields of science just waiting to be opened up, and I hope it'll happen soon.
Yes. And you've pioneered that path by making these ideas conceivable, then possible, then maybe even plausible and testable. So it's a difficult path to walk, but again, it opens, and not just for science, it opens lots of fields of inquiry about our everyday lives when it comes to perception, which we haven't discussed today, and consciousness and so on. So it's not just for scientists or philosophers, it's something that can be a gift to the whole world if we would study those questions with an open mind.
And I think we'd also find that these questions, as you mentioned, have been discussed for a very long period. Plato and the Neoplatonic tradition of philosophy in the early Christian centuries were discussing how memory works and how memory... This is a very long-standing debate. And so many of these questions are not entirely new, but we can approach them in a new way today thanks to the advances in experimental science.
Yes. And in other traditions too. They've been
Absolutely.
said over and over in many other traditions, which we also need to, in a way, recover and bring to our modern understanding. So there's a work of weaving things together too, integration. And that's fascinating. I don't see why we should be scared or reluctant. Well, I see why, because there are all these pressures we haven't discussed. But in any case, it's what we're doing. I think it's an invitation to consider those and enjoy this quest.
Very good.
Thank you so much, Rupert.
Thanks, Alex.